Samuel grew up, and the Lord was with him. That's how the first reading concludes. The Lord was with Samuel. The Lord was with him. Having just finished the Christmas season, don't forget that's why Jesus came into our world, to be with us. Emmanuel, God is with us. And as we now move into ordinary time, we have this same comforting thought that should be part of our ordinary knowledge, that the Lord is with us. Isn't that what we need to remember in every situation? That God is with us, even in our worries about weather, that God is with us. In fact, that's what you're reminded of constantly through the greetings of the Mass. The Lord be with you. That God is with us. But it can feel like at times that the Lord isn't with us, especially when things seem to go wrong, not as according to our plans. This Old Testament passage begins about Samuel by describing the days as ones in which the word of the Lord was scarce and vision was infrequent. So God didn't appear to speak to his people at that time. So was he no longer with them? And we might be tempted to believe the same thing. Does God just leave us to our own devices? Are we also living in a time in which the word of the Lord is scarce and vision infrequent? But it's not really the case. It wasn't really the case at Samuel's time, and it wasn't the case now. What's really happening is we're the ones who cease to listen for him. The many distractions of the noisy world that we have, media, social media, politics, all those things can make it difficult to hear God. Just see how hard it was for God trying to reveal himself to Samuel. He calls out to him multiple times, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel has no idea who it is. And that can happen for us the same way. That God is constantly trying to speak to you and I, to guide us, but we don't always recognize his voice. It's also important to note that when God begins, or that it's important to note when God begins, when he begins to speak to Samuel. It says that Samuel was but a youth. In other words, God doesn't wait until we're old enough to be with us, to speak to us, to call us to follow him. He begins calling us while we are still young. Makes sense, because sometimes when we're young, we can be more docile to God's call. We haven't yet been hardened by all the hurts and the pettiness of our fellow man, which can sometimes lead us also to distrust God himself. Yet, even if we fail to hear God when we're young, God continues to pursue us. So, if we don't always recognize God's voice at first, then that points out why it's so important to continually strive in a relationship with him. And Samuel has an advantage already in this. He's living in God's shrine at Shiloh, and he's learning his Jewish faith one-on-one from the priest Eli. And so, same way for us who have grown up in the practice of the faith, coming to Mass, utilizing various forms of Catholic education, taking advantage of all those different things, we have that same kind of advantage. It's an advantage of being around things of the faith, but as we see with Samuel, it's not enough. I'm sure we know other people who grew up in a Catholic environment and are not here at Mass, not because of the weather, but have left it behind in their lives. Our nation, too, has its origins in Christianity, but many values being tossed aside. Just because Samuel's in the temple didn't mean he automatically recognized God's voice. It says, Samuel did not yet recognize the Lord. Because it depends upon how we're living out the faith in our daily life, in our homes and families. In fact, it's possible, for example, for parents to either foster or to stifle a child's call, a child's vocation. At first, that's what happens, unfortunately, with Eli. Eli at first kind of stifles God's call to Samuel, telling him not to pay any attention to the voice, but just go back to sleep. Stop bothering me. So, how, as families, we talk about the faith, or how we don't talk about it, that will have a deep impact upon a child's ability to hear God's voice. For example, if a young man or a woman is called to the priesthood or religious life, but they've heard things in the home like, I don't know why anybody would want to be a priest or a nun. They certainly can't be happy if they can't get married. Besides, I want grandchildren. Leaders of the church, they're all corrupt cowards anyway. Those kind of talk at home can certainly do much to ensure that a child never hears that kind of a call from God. Fortunately for Samuel, Eli, though, finally recognizes what's going on, and that God is the one who may be trying to speak to him. And so he gives Samuel some good advice. He says, if you are called, reply, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." So, that can teach what we should do as parents or grandparents. What advice do we give our children? We might often say, you can be whatever you want to be. And that's not wrong, it's just incomplete, really. Better advice would be to follow Eli and ask, what does God want me to be? God, what do you want me to do? In other words, we teach them to listen for him. And I know that made a huge difference in my own life when I finally started doing that. Finally started asking, God, what do you want me to do? And in order to help somebody else, in order to help a child to hear God's voice, that means we have to continually be doing it ourselves. We have to be actively asking God what he wants of us each day before we can lead somebody else to do the same thing. Because we can't give what we don't have ourselves. And when we teach our children to listen to God, then they can better understand when it is that God's calling them and what God asks of them. And that happened for Samuel too. He follows Eli's advice, and when God calls to him again, he replies, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And God does indeed speak to Samuel, revealing Samuel's vocation to be a priest and a prophet. And the same thing is for us today, to place ourselves in God's presence and offer ourselves to him. Here I am, Lord, I come to do your will, and he will then guide us. He will reveal what he desires us to do. Of course, it can be scary placing that kind of trust in God, because he might ask us to do amazing things that we wouldn't be able to do on our own. Samuel too, he was also hesitant at first, but Eli assures him. Eli has Samuel describe to him what God spoke to him about. And since Eli had this greater experience of a relationship with God and his ways, Eli is able to affirm for Samuel that it was indeed coming from God. It is the Lord. What is pleasing in the Lord's sight, the Lord will do. So it's good for us, too, to get advice from those we trust who know the ways of God to help us discern if certain ideas or actions are indeed from God and part of his will. Because if it is him, then we need not fear. God will make it happen. He's the one in charge. He will be with you. Do not be afraid. So are we concerned about the disturbing, dissonant voices in our world today and wondering who the coming generations will be listening to? If we don't teach our children to listen for God, then they will hear and follow other voices. But if we do teach them, then they will hear and follow the Lord. Of course, we can't teach that unless we ourselves are listening to his voice. Speak, Lord, for your servants are listening. In listening, we will hear Jesus, and in hearing, we will know that he is here. Samuel grew up, and the Lord was with him. The Lord is with you.